The most expensive thing in a room is never the money. It's the dignity of the person everyone overlooks. The crystal chandeliers of Ashford House cast warm golden reflections across polished marble floors as conversations drifted through the packed dining room like soft waves. On a Friday night in downtown Chicago, every table was occupied. Executives celebrated mergers. Investors discussed markets. Couples raised glasses over candlelight. The restaurant hummed with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to success. Then everything stopped. $1,000 bill floated slowly through the air before landing on the floor beside a table near the center of the room. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Glasses froze in midair. Even the piano player missed a note. Ethan Blackwell leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually against the leather booth behind him. At 39, he had built one of the largest private investment firms in America. Magazines called him brilliant. Competitors called him ruthless. Most people simply called him rich. Tonight, the faint smile on his face carried something colder than confidence. His eyes remained fixed on the young waitress standing beside his table. Claire Bennett didn't move. She stood quietly with a black order book resting against her apron, her posture straight, her expression calm. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head, and the soft restaurant lighting reflected in her pale blue eyes. She looked ordinary. That was what most people thought when they first saw her. Ordinary. Ethan pointed toward the bill lying on the polished floor. "Pick it up," he said. No one spoke. The silence spread across the room like a shadow. Claire looked down briefly at the bill, then back at Ethan. Her face revealed nothing. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Not fear. The manager behind the hostess stand felt his stomach tighten. A server carrying drinks stopped walking. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One man discreetly lowered his phone, uncertain whether he should record what was happening. Ethan's smile widened slightly. He was used to this moment. Used to watching people calculate the value of their pride. Used to seeing hesitation give way to obedience. Money always won eventually. At least, that had been his experience. "Did you hear me?" he asked, his voice smooth and controlled. "It's yours if you pick it up." The $1,000 bill remained untouched between them. Claire took a slow breath. Around her, the entire restaurant seemed suspended in place. Somewhere outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. Inside, dozens of strangers waited for her next move. But Claire wasn't looking at the money anymore. She was looking directly at Ethan Blackwell. Calm, steady, unshaken. And for the first time that evening, something unexpected flickered behind Ethan's confident expression. Because the woman standing before him wasn't reacting the way everyone else did. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't lowering her eyes. She simply stood there, silent and composed, as though the $1,000 bill on the floor meant absolutely nothing at all. 3 hours earlier, neither of them knew their lives were about to collide in a way that would leave an entire restaurant speechless. 3 hours earlier, the city looked completely different. The rain had not started yet. Sunlight reflected off the glass towers surrounding Michigan Avenue, and downtown Chicago moved with its usual restless energy. Claire Bennett stepped off the bus carrying a canvas tote bag and a folder she had checked 3 times during the ride. She walked past crowded sidewalks, street musicians, and office workers rushing toward afternoon meetings. Most people never noticed her. She was simply another young woman in a city of millions. Claire preferred it that way. At 28, she had learned that attention was often overrated. Quiet gave people room to think. Quiet gave people room to heal. As she approached Ashford House, she paused briefly across the street. The elegant restaurant stood between 2 modern office buildings, its brass entrance gleaming beneath the afternoon sun. Tomorrow would be her final shift. After 4 years of balancing long hours, night classes, and responsibilities few people knew about, a different chapter of her life was finally beginning. The thought should have made her nervous. Instead, it brought a small smile to her face. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with preparation. Glasses sparkled beneath the lights. Tables were measured and adjusted with meticulous precision. Claire tied her apron, greeted the kitchen staff, and immediately started helping a new server organize place settings. She moved through the dining room with effortless calm. When a hostess dropped a stack of menus, Claire helped gather them. When a dishwasher called in sick, she volunteered to stay later if needed. Nobody asked her to. She simply did. That was who she was. Around 4 o'clock, her phone vibrated quietly inside her locker. The message came from her younger brother, Noah. Good luck tomorrow. Mom would be proud. Claire stared at the screen for a few seconds before locking the phone again. The familiar ache settled gently in her chest. It had been 3 years since their mother passed away after a long illness. 3 years since Claire had put nearly every dream on hold to care for her. She never regretted a single moment. Some sacrifices left scars. Others became foundations. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You are smiling today," said Maria, one of the senior servers. Claire laughed softly. "Am I?" "Definitely. Something good is happening." Claire glanced toward the locker where the folder rested safely inside her bag. "Maybe." She did not explain further. She rarely talked about herself. Most of her co-workers knew only fragments of her story. They knew she worked hard. They knew she never complained. They knew guests often requested her section because she treated every customer with equal respect, whether they ordered a cup of coffee or a $500 bottle of wine. What they did not know was that tomorrow morning, less than 12 hours after her final shift ended, Claire Bennett would walk onto a stage in Washington, D.C., to receive recognition that could change the course of her entire career. For now, however, none of that mattered. The dinner rush was approaching. Guests would soon fill every seat. And somewhere across the city, a man named Ethan Blackwell was finishing a meeting that had already put him in a very bad mood. Ethan Blackwell hated losing time. The black SUV rolled through late afternoon traffic while the Chicago skyline reflected across its tinted windows. Inside the quiet cabin, Ethan stared at a financial report on his tablet, his jaw tight. Across from him sat Daniel Mercer, his chief operating officer, who had worked alongside him for nearly a decade. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Daniel closed a folder and exhaled slowly. "The board still thinks the acquisition can be saved." Ethan did not look up. "The board is wrong." His voice was calm, but everyone who worked with him recognized the warning hidden beneath that calmness. 3 hours earlier, negotiations involving a multi-billion-dollar deal had collapsed after months of planning. Investors were frustrated. Executives were nervous. Reporters were already speculating. Ethan had spent 20 years building Blackwell Capital into one of the most powerful investment firms in the country, and failure remained something he tolerated poorly. The tablet screen dimmed. Ethan set it aside and glanced through the window. Hundreds of people moved along the sidewalks below. Most would never know his name beyond magazine covers and business headlines. They saw private jets, luxury hotels, and billion-dollar transactions. They did not see the pressure. They did not see the expectations. They certainly did not see the loneliness. "You should take a night off," Daniel said carefully. Ethan laughed once. It was not a happy sound. "People who take nights off do not build companies like mine." Daniel said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed Ethan's mind. Success had become more than a goal for Ethan Blackwell. It had become part of his identity. Every victory reinforced it. Every setback threatened it. As the vehicle approached downtown, Ethan loosened his tie slightly. The gesture seemed insignificant, but even that small movement revealed exhaustion. At 39, he was younger than many of his competitors and wealthier than most of them. Yet satisfaction remained strangely elusive. There was always another deal, another target, another mountain to climb. His phone buzzed. A message from an executive appeared on the screen. Another problem requiring immediate attention. Ethan read it, typed a brief response, and set the device down. "Ashford House tonight?" Daniel asked. Ethan nodded. 7 o'clock. "Private dinner?" "No," Ethan stared ahead. "I want people around me." The answer surprised Daniel because Ethan rarely enjoyed social environments. Crowds irritated him. Small talk bored him. But after difficult days, he occasionally chose busy restaurants simply to avoid going home to an empty penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. The SUV stopped at a red light. A young couple crossed the street holding hands while laughing about something neither executive could hear. Ethan watched them disappear into the crowd. For a moment, something unreadable passed through his eyes. Then it vanished. The light turned green. The vehicle continued toward downtown. By the time the sun began sinking behind the city skyline, Ethan Blackwell had made a decision. He would have dinner, review a few documents, and forget the disaster of the afternoon. It seemed like a simple plan. What he did not know was that before the night ended, a woman wearing a black apron and a quiet smile would challenge a belief he had carried for most of his life. The belief that everything, eventually, had a price. By 6:30, Ashford House glowed like a jewel against the darkening Chicago skyline. Rain had begun to fall outside, streaking softly across the tall windows while guests filtered through the front entrance beneath umbrellas and tailored coats. Inside, the dinner rush arrived with its usual rhythm. Silverware chimed. Glasses caught the warm light. Conversations rose and fell like distant music. Claire moved through the dining room with practiced ease, greeting guests, delivering menus, and quietly solving a dozen small problems nobody else noticed. A nervous young server nearly dropped a tray near the kitchen entrance. Claire steadied it before disaster struck and offered a reassuring smile. An elderly guest requested a different table away from a draft near the window. Claire arranged it within minutes. She never seemed rushed, never seemed overwhelmed. Around 7 o'clock, the front doors opened again. Several heads turned automatically. Ethan Blackwell entered with Daniel Mercer and 2 senior executives from Blackwell Capital. Expensive suits, confident posture, the unmistakable presence of men accustomed to being recognized. The hostess immediately guided them toward one of the best tables in the restaurant. Ethan barely noticed the attention. His mind remained trapped inside spreadsheets, negotiations, and the failed acquisition that still irritated him. As he sat down, Daniel attempted to lighten the mood. At least nobody is threatening to quit tonight. One executive laughed. Ethan did not. He opened a message on his phone and frowned. Another complication. Another delay. Another problem demanding attention. The evening was already testing his patience. Across the dining room, Claire received the assignment. Table 14. For guests. Corporate account. She glanced briefly toward the table and recognized Ethan immediately. Even people who did not follow business news knew his face. Still, her expression never changed. To her, he was simply another customer. She approached with menus in hand. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Ashford House. My name is Claire, and I will be taking care of you tonight. Her voice was calm and professional. Ethan looked up for only a second before returning his attention to his phone. Water, he said. Sparkling. Claire nodded. Of course. She moved away without reaction. Daniel noticed the exchange and almost smiled. Most people became nervous around Ethan. This waitress appeared completely unaffected. 20 minutes later, the table was covered with appetizers, drinks, and business documents. The discussion shifted between market forecasts and investment opportunities. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then a small accident changed the atmosphere. One of the younger executives reached for a glass while reviewing a report. His sleeve brushed the stem. The glass tipped. A splash of sparkling water spilled across the table. The liquid spread quickly towards several documents and the edge of Ethan's place setting. It was not a major incident. No one was hurt. Nothing valuable was damaged. But after the day Ethan had endured, it felt like one frustration too many. The conversation stopped. Silence settled over the table. Ethan stared at the wet surface for a long moment. His jaw tightened. The young executive immediately apologized. I am sorry. That was my fault. Claire arrived almost instantly with fresh napkins, already moving to help clean the spill. The situation should have ended there. A simple mistake. A routine inconvenience. But frustration rarely follows logic. Sometimes it simply looks for somewhere to land. And as Ethan watched Claire step forward to assist, an idea began forming in his mind. An idea that would soon leave the entire restaurant holding its breath. Claire quickly absorbed the remaining moisture with fresh linen napkins, while the conversation around the table faded into an uneasy silence. Everything is under control, she said politely. I will have these replaced immediately. The younger executive looked relieved. Daniel Mercer nodded appreciatively. The situation could have ended there. It should have ended there. But Ethan Blackwell was no longer thinking about a glass of water. He was thinking about the failed acquisition, the disappointing meetings, the endless pressure. The entire day had left him frustrated, and frustration often searched for a target. His fingers drifted toward his wallet. Claire finished arranging the table and stepped back. Is there anything else I can help you with this evening, sir? Ethan slowly removed a crisp $1,000 bill and placed it on the table. Several people nearby noticed immediately. Money had a way of attracting attention. Claire remained professional. Would you like me to bring the check? She asked. Ethan ignored the question. Instead, He picked up the bill between two fingers and held it for a moment. The surrounding conversations began to quiet. Daniel felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had seen this side of Ethan before. Not often, but enough to recognize it. The side that emerged when pride mixed with irritation. Ethan glanced at Claire. Then he let the bill fall. It drifted downward before settling on the polished floor beside her shoes. The sound was almost non-existent. Yet somehow it felt louder than every voice in the room. Claire looked down briefly, then back up. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Pick it up," he said. The words landed heavily. Several nearby diners exchanged shocked glances. A server froze beside the wine station. The hostess near the entrance stopped moving entirely. Claire did not react immediately. Her face remained calm. Ethan interpreted her silence as hesitation. "It is yours," he continued. $1,000 for 5 seconds of effort seems like a good deal." Nobody laughed. Nobody smiled. Even his own executives looked uncomfortable. Daniel lowered his eyes. He knew this was a mistake. Claire stood perfectly still. The restaurant lights reflected softly in her blue eyes. There was no anger there. No embarrassment. Only composure. Ethan expected her to bend down. Most people would. $1,000 represented rent, groceries, utility bills, opportunity. He believed everyone had a number. Everyone eventually made a calculation. The room waited. Seconds stretched longer. Somewhere near the back of the dining room, a fork touched a plate with a faint metallic sound before silence returned. Claire finally spoke. Her voice was soft. "Sir, are you asking me to pick up the bill?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I am. And if I do not?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Ethan's expression. The question was not defiant. It was not emotional. It was simple, direct, honest. Ethan folded his hands together. "Then you walk away from easy money." Claire glanced once more at the bill resting on the floor. Then she looked around the dining room. Dozens of eyes watched her. Some nervous, some sympathetic, some curious. When she finally returned her attention to Ethan, her expression remained unchanged. Calm, steady, almost impossibly calm. And that calmness began to unsettle him far more than any argument ever could. The silence seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the glow of the chandeliers reflected across polished glass and silver. Claire Bennett stood exactly where she was. She did not move toward the bill. She did not step away from it either. Ethan Blackwell watched her carefully, waiting for the moment he believed always came. The moment when practicality defeated principle. But it never arrived. "You are turning down $1,000? Ethan asked. His voice remained controlled, though a trace of disbelief had begun to creep into it. Claire offered a small, polite smile. "No, sir." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then what exactly are you doing?" Claire glanced briefly at the bill resting on the floor. "I am simply choosing not to earn it that way." A murmur moved through the room. Not loud, barely audible, but it was enough. Ethan felt it immediately. The shift, the attention, the fact that people were no longer watching her. They were watching him. Daniel Mercer leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time all evening, he saw uncertainty flicker behind Ethan's confidence. Most people became defensive under pressure. Claire was doing something entirely different. She was remaining calm. Calm enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. "That seems like an expensive principle," Ethan said. Claire nodded slightly. "Perhaps. You could do a lot with $1,000. That is true. Yet you are willing to leave it on the floor." "Yes." Ethan studied her face. The answer came too easily, too naturally. There was no hesitation, no regret. Around them, the restaurant remained frozen in collective anticipation. Even guests who had no idea who Ethan Blackwell was could sense that something unusual was unfolding. A contest neither person had expected. Not of money, not of status, of values. "You know who I am, do you not?" Ethan asked. Claire met his gaze. "Yes, sir." "Then you understand that I have built companies worth billions of dollars." "I do. And you still think this is the wrong decision?" Claire took a slow breath. "Respectfully, sir, I think it depends on what someone is trying to buy." The words landed softly, yet they seemed to echo throughout the dining room. Daniel looked down at the table. One executive shifted awkwardly in his seat. A couple near the window exchanged glances. Ethan stared at Claire for several moments. He was accustomed to arguments, accustomed to challenges, accustomed to people trying to prove something. But she was not arguing. She was not trying to win. She was simply standing her ground without anger, without hostility, without fear. That was what unsettled him, because confidence usually announced itself. Hers did not. Hers simply existed. Claire finally looked toward the service station where another table needed assistance. If there is nothing else you need this evening, I should return to my other guests. Ethan did not answer immediately. For the first time since the exchange began, he realized he no longer felt in control of it. And somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a distinguished older gentleman who had been quietly observing the entire scene lowered his newspaper, looked directly at Claire Bennett, and suddenly seemed to recognize her. The older gentleman slowly rose from his table near the window. At first, almost nobody noticed him. He was in his 70s, dressed in a charcoal suit, with silver hair and the kind of quiet presence that did not demand attention. Yet the moment he stood, several guests seemed to recognize him. Whispers moved through the dining room. Ethan glanced in his direction. Then his expression changed. Professor Whitmore, one of the executives, murmured under his breath. Dr. Henry Whitmore was not a celebrity in the traditional sense. He was something rarer, an economist whose research had influenced government policy, university programs, and financial institutions across the country. For more than 40 years, his work had shaped the careers of some of the most successful leaders in America. The professor folded his newspaper neatly beneath one arm and walked toward table 14. The room grew even quieter. Claire looked surprised. "Professor Whitmore," she said warmly. "It is good to see you again." The older man smiled. "Claire Bennett." His voice carried the calm authority of a lifelong teacher. "I was wondering how long it would take before someone recognized you." Several heads turned immediately. Ethan frowned. "You know each other?" Professor Whitmore looked at him. "Know each other?" A faint laugh escaped him. "Mr. Blackwell, 5 years ago, she was one of the most extraordinary students I ever taught." Silence. Complete silence. Claire lowered her eyes slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Ethan stared at her. "A student?" "Not just a student," the professor continued. "The brightest researcher in our graduate program." The words landed like stones in still water. Around the restaurant, people exchanged confused glances. A server stopped carrying plates. The manager stepped closer. Daniel Mercer leaned forward. "Graduate program, where?" Professor Whitmore answered without hesitation. "The University of Chicago." Even Ethan recognized the significance immediately. One of the most respected academic institutions in the country. The professor smiled at Claire. "Your economic resilience paper is still being referenced by students today." Claire looked almost embarrassed. "That was a long time ago." "Good work remains good work," he replied. Ethan felt something shifting beneath his assumptions. The woman he had dismissed as an ordinary waitress no longer fit the image he had created. If she was such an exceptional student, Ethan asked carefully, "why is she working here?" The professor's expression softened. For the first time, sadness touched his eyes. "Because life does not always follow talent." Nobody spoke. When her mother became ill, Claire withdrew from opportunities that most young economists spend years chasing. Fellowships, research grants, international programs. He paused. She stayed home to take care of her family. Claire looked toward the floor for a moment. The professor continued quietly. "Very few people are willing to sacrifice a promising future for someone else." Claire was. Ethan said nothing. The $1,000 bill still rested on the floor beside the table. Untouched. Forgotten. Suddenly, it seemed much smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Blackwell began to wonder whether he had completely misunderstood the person standing in front of him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The rain continued tracing soft lines across the windows while the restaurant remained suspended in a silence that felt almost unreal. Ethan Blackwell looked at Claire Bennett as though seeing her for the first time. Not the uniform, not the apron, not the role she occupied tonight. The person. Across the table, Professor Whitmore adjusted his glasses and studied Ethan carefully. "There is something else you should know," he said. Claire immediately shook her head. "Professor, that is not necessary." "I believe it is." His voice remained gentle but firm. Ethan felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. "What is he talking about?" Professor Whitmore looked directly at him. 3 years ago, your company nearly entered one of the most disastrous infrastructure investments in recent memory. Daniel Mercer blinked. "The Midwestern Energy Expansion Proposal." "Exactly." Ethan remembered it immediately. A deal that had appeared promising on the surface but contained serious long-term risks hidden beneath optimistic projections. Blackwell Capital had ultimately walked away just weeks before signing. The decision had saved hundreds of millions of dollars. What does that have to do with Claire? Ethan asked. The professor smiled faintly. The research that identified the flaws in that project originated from a university policy study. Daniel suddenly leaned forward. Wait. His eyes moved toward Claire. That report. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Not out of embarrassment. More like resignation. The professor nodded. She wrote most of it. Silence returned. Ethan stared at her. You are saying that analysis came from her? Yes. The report that predicted the infrastructure failures? Yes. Ethan felt the room tilt slightly. He remembered reading portions of that research years earlier. He remembered executives dismissing it because the author was unknown. He remembered eventually trusting the conclusions because the data was impossible to ignore. A decision that had protected his firm from enormous losses. Nobody ever mentioned your name, Ethan said quietly. Claire offered a small smile. Research is not usually about recognition. You saved my company from a very expensive mistake. I contributed to a report, she corrected gently. Many people worked on it. But Ethan knew what he was hearing. The woman standing before him was not simply intelligent. She was one of the people whose work had influenced decisions inside boardrooms she would never enter. And tonight, she had been serving drinks while he assumed she could be measured with $1,000 bill. Ethan glanced downward. The money still rested on the floor exactly where it had fallen. Untouched. Meaningless. Suddenly, he felt embarrassed by it. More embarrassed than he had felt in years. Around them, guests watched quietly. Not with judgment. Not with hostility. With curiosity. Waiting to see what happened next. Claire remained composed. The same calm expression. The same steady posture. Nothing about her had changed. Only the assumptions surrounding her. And that realization struck Ethan harder than anything Professor Whitmore had said. Because Claire Bennett had not become impressive during the last 10 minutes. She had been impressive the entire time. He simply had not bothered to see it. The dining room remained quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now. Earlier, people had been waiting to see whether Claire Bennett would surrender her dignity for $1,000. Now they were witnessing something far rarer. A man confronting the possibility that he had been completely wrong. Ethan Blackwell slowly stood from his chair. No one expected it. The executives at his table exchanged surprised looks. Daniel Mercer watched carefully. Across the room, guests paused their conversations once again. Ethan looked down at the bill on the floor. Then, without a word, he bent down and picked it up himself. The gesture lasted only a moment, yet it seemed to change the atmosphere of the entire restaurant. Claire remained still. Professor Whitmore folded his hands quietly. Ethan turned toward her. For perhaps the first time in many years, he seemed unsure of what to say. Money had always given him confidence. Numbers made sense. Contracts made sense. Markets made sense. But this moment felt different. There was no negotiation. No strategy. No advantage to gain. Only the truth. Claire, he said softly, I owe you an apology. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Ethan looked around the room before returning his gaze to her. I made an assumption tonight. His voice was steady, but stripped of its usual authority. Actually, I made several. Claire listened without expression. I assumed your job defined your value. I assumed money would influence your decision. And I assumed I understood the person standing in front of me. He paused briefly. I was wrong. The words seemed to settle across the room. Honest. Uncomfortable. Real. Claire studied him for a moment. Then she smiled gently. Not triumphantly. Not proudly. Simply kindly. Thank you, she said. Ethan looked relieved, though the embarrassment remained visible. I would like to make this right. Claire shook her head almost immediately. You already have. Ethan frowned slightly. How? You apologized. The simplicity of her answer caught him off guard. In his world, problems were solved with larger gestures, larger numbers, larger solutions. Claire seemed to operate by different rules entirely. Professor Whitmore smiled quietly to himself. Ethan looked at the $1,000 bill still in his hand. Then he folded it and returned it to his wallet. Not because he wanted to keep it, because he finally understood that it had never been relevant. Tomorrow, Professor Whitmore said, breaking the tension, someone will be receiving a national award for economic research. Several guests looked toward Claire in surprise. She laughed softly and shook her head. "Professor." "What?" he asked innocently. "The secret is already out." A ripple of warm laughter moved through the restaurant. The tension finally began to dissolve. For the first time all evening, Ethan smiled. A genuine smile. Small but real. Outside, the rain continued falling over Chicago. Inside, conversations slowly resumed. Glasses clinked. Music returned. Life moved forward. Yet many people would remember that evening for a very long time. Not because a millionaire lost an argument. Not because a waitress revealed impressive credentials. But because they witnessed something simpler. A reminder that dignity cannot be purchased. Respect cannot be demanded. And the most remarkable people are often the ones nobody notices at first. As Claire returned to her duties and Ethan quietly sat back down, one lesson lingered in the air long after the night was over. Some people appear ordinary only because true character never needs to announce itself.